issue of the relation of poiesis and praxis is definitely the question what kind of poiesis can be the right praxis.
Well, if I use the distinction a bit of poiesis as a making and praxis as a doing.
Heidegger's thinking puts poiesis, puts action in the forefront in a way that philosophy didn't manage to do up until that point.
I understand the making more broadly as a kind of almost an aesthetic or a creative modality, but even in a Heideggerian sense, a world making.
I see today clearer than I guess before that philosophy is not able to produce a life form as a philosophical one.
Philosophy comes very, very close to Judaism, comes very, very close to Torah, to the rabbinic tradition, in the way that it approaches the question of poiesis and praxis. I think the approaches ultimately really are quite divergent. I think poiesis in Heidegger shows us what praxis is not.
In the final analysis, the parameters of a world that one inhabits, within which one dwells, that has to be assessed or judged against the doing.
The topic that I left when I left you at Carmel was the question of religion and poiesis.
Yeah.
All religion.
Concerns the Heideggerian quotation I brought. What was it in German? So wäre alle Religion ihrem Wesen nach poetisch, so all religion would be poetic in its essence.
Right.
At first, it must be interpreted this phrase because what Hölderlin is not thinking that religion is a poetical artwork like the artwork of a certain famous poet. But what is it then? It could be then only something like that there is an impersonal, maybe primordial poiesis in language as a source, then also for holy texts, not only for poetical texts in the more narrow sense, but also for holy texts, and that there is actually seeing the problem from this side that there is no difference, that there is a belonging together between then you can say the hymns of Hölderlin in this sense and to be scandalous the Torah, that there is in this sense no essential difference. And I guess it's like that he thinks it. And it's up to you to say something about that because because I know that of course the problem of the problem of the historical fact that also religious texts are emerging in a certain time. I guess the oldest Torah roll is 1,300 before Christ. Yeah, in this.
According to tradition, so Sinai
Yeah.
is in the year 1313 BCE. Right. That's a traditional. Seder. There's a text called Seder Olam Rabbah from the Tannaitic period, which basically lays out the chronology of Jewish history, and it positions Sinai in the year 1312 or 1313 before the Common Era.
Yeah. But
of course, the Wellhausen school will have a very different approach.
But finally, it's the question whether these kind of texts, whether the Torah, who's the author of the Torah?
Great.
And
there we go.
This is something. That's probably not the problem of who's the the author of certain Kabbalist texts. We know the authors, but concerning the Torah, it's of course a question linked with this idea of Hölderlin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to kick in or? Yeah.
Well, you could start.
I'll tell you this. Can I have just a few minutes to develop this thesis? Yeah. Okay. So I've been reading Virgil lately, the Aeneid. Mm-hmm. Virgil deliberately wrote the Aeneid. It's the last work that he wrote in his life, and he wrote it specifically almost as a kind of political. I wouldn't say propaganda, but because that's way too over the top. But it's kind of poetic justification of Octavian's state, specifically Octavian, right? He was, although he's older than Octavian, he's from the time of Julius Caesar, but it's definitely a defense of the centrality of the Roman Empire in world history. Now, of course, it's a beautiful text, but one thing that really disturbed me in Virgil is that, I don't remember exactly where, but it's definitely not on the first page. Definitely not. It's definitely, it might be in the first Aeneid, if that's what they're called, books. I don't remember if they're called books. It might be, but I think it's even in the second book, where Virgil says, after his introductory preamble, he says, "Oh Muse, help me Muse, to compose my poem," Virgil says. And I was very shocked because my assumption was that ancient authors would, and I'm thinking, of course, specifically of Homer and of Hesiod. Both Homer and Hesiod, in both of Homer's poems, he has only two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are the two oldest texts of Western civilization, of European, civilization, right? Homer's poems, and Hesiod, the Theogony. Both of them, in the very, very first line, they say, "Sing, O Muse," O Musa, right? Muse, sing. So I always understood Homer to be saying, look, this is not my poem. Sing, O Muse. You will sing, and I will be your stenographer. I will record what you are singing. I will be your man on earth, but you, the song that is coming out, is not really my own. So when I read Virgil, I was shocked that he doesn't say it at the beginning. Why does he wait? And moreover, not only does he not say it at the beginning, but he doesn't say, "Sing, O Muse," he says, "Help me. Help me." As if he himself he gives himself a lot more power, as it were, as a poet, vis-a-vis the muse, than Homer does. When I read Heidegger's thoughts on poiesis and also Hölderlin, it seems to me that they are much more, both of them, as I understand them, are much more authentic to the Homeric model, as it were. Especially when Hölderlin speaks of, going out, bearing the poet has his head bare to the thunderbolts of Zeus and so on. So there's a sense of ecstasis, of giving in to the muse or to the gods in Hölderlin's language, where the poet is, as it were, instrumental, merely an instrument for the voice of the gods. Now, how does that compare with Judaism? And I want to emphasize, because I think maybe it's not clear enough, but my understanding is not rooted in Kabbalah. I hope that's clear. My understanding is actually rooted in biblical texts, the Midrashic texts, the Talmudic texts, and the medieval commentators, and the Jewish philosophers, the medieval ones and the modern ones. So my understanding of Judaism on this point, vis-a-vis the Heideggerian and Hölderlinian understanding, which I think is the right understanding of poiesis, is that while it is probably true, and I think it is true, that there's a strong element of poiesis in the Torah, and in Maaseh Bereshit, in how we understand creation. And Elliot, I hope you will clarify this for me. I only have a limited understanding of how the Sefer Yetzirah might work in this respect as a poietic text, a text that speaks of the poiesis of the world. As Heidegger says, poiesis is Wort werden sein. Sein, I don't remember the language exactly, but becoming word.
Yeah.
Wort werden sein. I think something like that. And he says it in the Einführung in 1935 in metaphysics, and he says it in the Erläuterungen, the early text on Heidegger. So there definitely is an element of poiesis in God's creating the world. At the same time, and this is what I would like to underscore, without undermining that poietic element, I would say that at the same time there's something more than poiesis happening in the Torah. Not Kabbalah necessarily, I don't know, Elliot will have to teach me, but definitely in the Torah, definitely in the Jewish tradition at large, there's something more than poiesis, and I, for lack of a better word, call that communication. Communication happens between I and thou. It's me telling you something. God would like to communicate something to us, whereas the poet, and here we'll probably argue, the poet, I don't think he has the same intentions. It's not to say that the poet is not a communicative person. Of course he is. He also has something to communicate to the people. However, I would say that there's something more monological in the poet. It's more of a monologue where the muse needs to, as it were, express herself, where the poet, in a kind of sympathetic pathos in relation to the muse, needs to express himself. And it's not necessarily the issue of whether he is heard and whether he's communicating something good and valuable to the listeners. That's not as primary an issue as it is in the Torah.
Just to say something, the one thing is, I guess, the very traditional idea of inspiration, that the poet is a medium of, well, a certain spirit or muse or something. I guess that even this counts for the authors of the New Testament, that there is a theory like that they are inspired in a way by God, that they are only a medium in this way, that they are not artists but media. That would be then, but I think that wouldn't be the model for you concerning the Torah. I don't think so.
Well, it's complicated. Yeah. This is why I hope it's complicated, because it is, that factor is there. There's this idea, a midrashic idea, that says that God spoke through the throat, migrono shel Moshe. God's voice, as it were, came out of the throat of Moses, which is a very poetic model, I think. I think that's exactly the Homeric model. God is using Moses as an instrument, as an amplifier, if you like, to communicate to humanity, also in the language of men. That's also an idea, in the language of human beings, in other words, which means the divine is already compromising whatever divine language or pre-language might be. But all I'm saying is that in addition to that, and I truly and honestly don't know how to put these two elements together properly. To me, they are disparate elements, and I don't know how to bring them together. All I want to say is that it seems to me there's another more vital element than poiesis, and that poiesis is the instrumental aspect of this other element. Poiesis is a necessity for Moses and for God. But the essence of what's going on in the Torah is not the essence, not only the essence, not that it's not poiesis not there, but the essence is not poiesis, but rather communication. God would like to say something specifically to the human being, for the benefit of the human being, out of love for the human being, not out of a need to express himself, not as pure expression. I've said enough, please.
I guess the first thing I would say, I mean, I can't adopt Holderlin's comment because it's too much of a generalization for me, right? That all religion is poetic. But if we understand poiesis as in the Heideggerian sense of being becoming word, there's no question that that's an appropriate locution to capture not just the Kabbalah, but truly the history of Jewish mysticism, including the Sefer Yetzirah, which you invoked. And it may also be extended to the Midrashic sensibility as well, which of course is a deep reading of the scriptural texts, both the first chapter of Genesis and certain of the Psalms, which invoke the word as the means by which the divine creates. But in the mystical tradition, that's expanded from an instrumentality to an ontology, which is to say, it's not only that language is the means by which God creates, but the nature of what is created is constituted by language. So on that we agree. But I would go, an additional element of the poiesis to me, which I think in part can be elicited from Heidegger, which I think also can be applied here to the Kabbalah more specifically, is thinking of it as a speaking of the unspeakable, or that the poetic word is a saying which preserves the unsayable in its very sayability, and hence it's an imagining the unimaginable. And so I want to share with you, I have this big book called Language, Eros, Being, which first I begin with a quote from Heraclitus, which may be worth putting on the table. In taking the poets as testimony for things unknown, they are citing authorities that cannot be trusted. So that's an interesting.
So what does that mean?
It's Heraclitus. Well, I don't know. Well,
I don't understand what it means.
Well, if he indeed said this, who knows? It's preserved later on. But he's saying, well, there's something untrustworthy about the poets if you're relying on them for telling you something of that which is unknowable.
You shouldn't trust the poets.
You shouldn't trust.
Well, that's also just what Aristotle. All poets are lying.
All poets are
lying. But by the way, this is at the beginning of the metaphysics. But this is actually a quotation of a poet. So he quotes a poet who's
That's right, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Of an honest poet.
That's good.
Who lies? An honest poet who lies.
That's a paradox.
The liar's paradox, right?
All right. Okay, but what I really wanted to share with you is the following quote from Sholem, the conclusion of his remarks when he received the Bialik Prize in 1977. And this is what Sholem said. So he died in 82, right? 1982, so several years before he died. He says, the discovery of the tremendous poetic potential within Kabbalah, in its own language, no less than in its poetry proper, meaning here he's distinguishing those Kabbalists who actually wrote poetry versus the entirety of Kabbalistic literature, which contains this poetic potential, which has also come down to us with great richness. All these constitute a realm which has hardly been examined and which holds the promise of great discoveries. The tools have not yet been created for understanding the lyric plane within language of the Kabbalists and the Hasidim. Without creating these tools, this questioning cannot be fully encompassed. My own secret longing to do so has not been fulfilled and remains unsatisfied. Thus, at the conclusion of my remarks, allow me to express the wish that we may look forward to someone who will remove the dust, hiding the true face of such books as Sefer Tmunah, Brit Menucha, and Chemdat Yamim. These are three Kabbalistic works, to reveal the poetic depths in their imagery and that of many similar books. So, so I think, I concur with Sholem here, that there's a way in which we can really look to the Kabbalah as the poiesis of the Jewish tradition, acknowledging with you and admitting with you that there are many other streams in Judaism for which this may not be which this may not apply. There's more I could say about this. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to expand on other elements of this, but I want to address what you were saying. And I often hear in you the Levinasian echo or trace.
Absolutely, big influence on me.
Right. And I certainly, respect that. And it seems to be, in a way, we could cast what you just said here as Levinas's disagreement with Heidegger in terms of the primordiality of ethics over metaphysics.
And by the way, Buber is equally important for me.
Buber and Rosenthal. I mean,
Levinas. They're in the same camp for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the common denominator there is the dialogical, right?
Yes, exactly.
And so I think you even use the term monological for the poet.
Yes, exactly.
So,
which is also Buber's word, right?
Yeah. So
he says Heidegger is a monologue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I understand and I appreciate that. Philosophically, I've interrogated Levinas. I don't know if you've ever looked at it, but in the book Giving Beyond the Gift, Overcoming Theomania, I criticize Levinas on terms that are actually appropriate here, and I wonder what you would say in response to me. As much as he would like to make space for an alterity, what he calls in the first book, the
totality.
Huh?
In totality.
In totality,
Yeah.
the infinity, which can't be circumscribed within the totality, and what he calls later on the otherwise than being.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of otherness or of alterity, but to the extent that he personifies that alterity and makes it a vibrant force in some kind of religious commitment and practice, he is guilty, if you will, of a poetic configuration of the other. As much as he wants to speak of it as a face, and he's using the face to mark that which can never be thingified or reified, as marking that which is in its otherness, right? If he makes that somehow, I'm struggling to find the right words. If he makes that somehow relevant to a religious lifestyle, prayer, let's say. Let's start with just prayer. I mean, if prayer is going to have any meaningful resonance for him, then there is ipso facto a personification of that alterity. And in that respect, and now I'm just finishing, in that respect,
take your time.
It's not exactly what the Kabbalists do, of course. But it's on a par with the Kabbalists do, insofar as it comes back to, again, of ascribing form to that which is formless. And now there's just one final point. I don't know if you remember. Everybody, when it comes to the Song of Songs, everybody kind of remembers that the rabbis famously privileged the figurative or allegorical reading of it, such that the male persona is the divine and the female persona is the community of Israel. And they cite Rabbi Akiva's famous dictum, which is in the Mishnah, which apparently was the rationale for its being included in the canon. If all the writings are holy, the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. But there's another dictum transmitted in the name of Rabbi Akiva, which says, had none of the Torah been given, the Song of Songs would have been sufficient, mm-hmm. because the Song of Songs is equal to the entirety of the Torah.
Right.
And what I understand by that is the insight that the Song of Songs is the work of poiesis par excellence, insofar as its literal meaning is figurative.
I like that. I mean, I think there's more than one way to maybe read that, but definitely I think it's a nice way to read it.
There's always more.
No. All I mean by that is that focuses on the, which I think it's wonderful. It focuses on the fact of the poem, of the Song of Song as a poem, rather than on its content.
No.
So explain again, because I misunderstood.
It's not what I'm saying. It's true that the Song of Songs is an aggregation of different poems, but that's not the point. The point is that the marker here of the poetic is the content. that the literal is figurative. So that it's imparting a sense of an inherent metaphoricity to language, which now has to be extended to all of the Torah. Because if now I'm venturing outside of the confines of the scriptural parameters themselves. Once you get to a point where you think of the God of Israel as not having a discernible form, then any representation of it will be metaphorical.
Yes.
And that brings it back into the domain of the poetic.
Is it that you think that the text itself is poetical, not only the source of the text, but the text itself speaks in a poetical way?
Yeah. And I'm understanding that in terms of this convergence of the literal and the figurative, and then extending it, because Akiva's dictum was, it's equivalent to all of the Torah. It's equivalent. So, what sense is it equivalent? Now, you could also focus on the erotic dimension. So, of course, I agree with you. There's always more than one way to interpret.
Well, by the way, that could be also in this quotation of Hölderlin. If he says that all religion is poetical in its essence, that's not far away. Could be brought together with what you said. But just to be a little bit more radical, or I don't know whether it's more radical, but a question to you, and I understand what you said, but the thing is, what is the relation between Hashem and poiesis? So, because one could say that Hölderlin's idea is that poiesis is Hashem itself. So God is poiesis.
Is the poiesis itself?
Yeah, could be. One could interpret that like that. So in this sense, one could ask, what is the meaning of bara at the beginning of the Torah? Is creation something what must be created, or is creation the essence of the Creator? So is, well, we have to say that, is God nothing else than creation?
I think, let me try.
Is God nothing else than poiesis?
I hear something very similar between what both of you are saying, and correct me if I'm wrong. What I hear, and which I think is very beautiful, what Elliot is saying, as I understand, is, and I know this from here and from his other works, Elliot has developed a very fascinating and very compelling reading of what a veil is. Of course, when we say veil, we typically mean we make a dichotomy between what is covered and the covering. And Elliot has very powerfully shown, both I think in Heidegger, and convincingly, by the way, both in Heidegger and in Jewish texts, in the Kabbalah, that actually, when the veil is understood fully, then you understand that the veil is the face itself. As he puts it, that the concealment is the most unconcealed thing, ultimately. As it were, the mask is the face. There is no mask, but you have to work to get there. It takes a lot of work to get to that point. And I think what he just said now is along those lines. He's applying that in language. In language, the similar dynamic is between the literal and the metaphorical, where the literal is more immediate and the metaphorical creates a distance that has to be traversed between what je veux dire, what I want to say, and what I end up saying, which is some terrible and tragic compromise of my intentions. And what Elliot is saying beautifully, and again, I love it, and not only do I have no problem with it, I completely and warmly embrace it. He is saying that he's questioning the dichotomy between the literal and the metaphorical. And he's saying that properly, and you'll stop me if I'm wrong here, that the metaphorical is actually the highest level of the literal, by the same logic.
I think that's the insight transmitted in the name of Rabbi Akiva with respect to the Song of Songs.
And I think that's your reading of the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
That's my reading.
I think that's the title. The title of his book, Open Secret, is exactly this. When he says open secret, he means that this is a secret. You know, it was the famous open secret in New Mexico, the atom bomb. Everyone knew where they were testing the atom bomb, but it was top secret. But everybody knows it's there, so it's an open secret, right? It's up to you to see the secret. And now I wonder if that logic, that dynamic, can be applied to exactly what you're saying, which is that if that is the case, if the metaphorical, in some profound sense, is more intimately bound up with what wants to be said. In other words, if the said is more bound up with the sayer, it's not just that what ends up in language, in the repository of language, somehow faithfully captures the veut dire of the sayer, but what you're saying, which is, I think, wild and beautiful, is that actually the said is the sayer, the one who says. And so, as you're saying, that the poem is actually the poet.
Yeah.
That God, in other words, is both the poem and the poet.
Yeah.
That would work for the Kabbalistic reading.
Yeah?
Yeah, sure. Because the first, I think you invoked the Zoharic passage. You said it in the name of the Bahir, but it really is the Zoharic.
Oh,
that
okay.
the first verse in Genesis, Elohim, God, is not the subject, the object. In the beginning,
Okay.
Ein Sof, who's not mentioned, of course he can't be mentioned because he's outside the textual parameters, is what creates God.
You know, I think, yeah, no, I definitely have no problem with this, obviously. You know, I'll tell you, this is my only, as it were, interjection into this. And by the way, I think this would be my, even though I am a Chabad Chassid, this is actually where I think you're more of a Chabad Chassid than I am.
More of a Chabad.
Yeah, I really do. I think you are, because I think on this point there's this idea that it tzimtzum in lo kifshutoi, that the tzimtzum is not really happening, in a sense, goes along with this idea in a way. No,
tzimtzum lo kifshuto means actually, there was a debate amongst Kabbalists. Was the contraction actual, which is to say literal, or not? So Chabad is of the opinion it's not literal, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means that it's only a concealment and not an actual withdrawal. That's what they mean by it. So it did actually happen, but how do we understand what happened? Because it's impossible for the infinite to withdraw its light, because if it did withdraw its light, then there truly could be nothing. And not in a good sense.
Let me ask you this. It seems to me that that insight, tzimtzum lo kifshuto, as you're explaining it, goes very, very well with Heidegger. And if we could say, crudely put, it seems to me that one of Heidegger's, if not Heidegger's biggest, okay, I'm being too hyperbolic, but a big contribution of Heidegger, in a sense, is that he destroyed, he removed the distinction, the classical philosophical distinction between metaphysics and epistemology.
Same.
In other words, when we say metaphysics classically, our focus is on the objects of what we're discussing, whether that's das Seiende or whether it's God. These are objects. When we discuss epistemology, we're not talking about the objects anymore. We're backing out and we're saying, how do we know that everything that we're saying is true, false, and this and that? So we're not talking about the objects. We're talking about how we know the objects. It seems to me that Heidegger's great chiddush, Heidegger's great novelty in philosophy, was to say that distinction is very, very questionable. And the way his language is, whenever he says something along the lines of being is thinking.
Yeah.
It is thinking. It's not that thinking is superimposed upon being, but rather that thinking itself is an emanation of being itself. That is a radical questioning of the distinction between epistemology and metaphysics. And tzimtzum lo kifshutoi, in a sense, is the same thing.
Well,
that's not so clear in Heidegger. I just want
Sorry?
to say,
It's not clear?
I don't think
No?
that this is not so clear, like you said, that being is thinking. That, by the way, that that's actually a metaphysical also idea in Aristotle. Yeah, that
Sure. In the Anima.
At the end in Book 12 of Metaphysics, that the divine is noesis.
Noesis noesios. Yeah.
And but for Heidegger, it's not so clear. It's that Heidegger sometimes has a more, to say that, dialogical model of that, that he is, that being must come to language, of course, but that language is not already being itself. But sometimes it's, like you said, it's closer, it comes closer to that. But I would never say that he says that being is thinking. I wouldn't, because of course there is the unthought and there is the unsayable in that, and that cannot be in. This cannot be. That it's a problem of thinking. How can thinking think something what is not thinkable?
Yeah.
Sure.
It must be something what withdraws from thinking.
Yeah.
I'm overstating it.
Therefore, I would say that was a little bit too much. Maybe it's in Kabbalah, it's things like that. But in Heidegger, I would say I would be careful.
All I meant to say, I'm sorry, you're totally right. It was much too dogmatic what I said. In the same way that poetry is being coming to word, I would say that thinking is being coming to thought. That's all. Not that thinking exhausts.
When he reflects on the Parmenidean dictum that thinking and being are the same, he gives it his togar auto is the beginning of it. He gives it his Heideggerian spin.
Yeah.
That the same
same
means the different.
Yeah. It's a auto.
It's the same and not the same.
So, but what was your question to me?
Well, I mean, look, I'll jump to what...
I lost the train of thought.
I was trying to connect it with, it seems so lokiv shutoi. Why? Because there it seems to me that what the Alter Rebbe does is that if the Tzimtzum, the way it's typically and crudely understood, kivshutoi, is a metaphysics. It's a metaphysical account. It's saying, look, and that's... And
again,
it takes...
the question is the light withdrawn?
Yes.
Or concealed? Now, I mean, this may sound to the contemporary ear like the argument of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But for the Kabbalists in the late 16th, early 17th centuries, they were trying to figure out what Luria was teaching. So does he mean that actually there is a withdrawal?
Right, so...
Or as the Chabad masters took it, no, isn't an act. Nobody understood it. Shalok Pshuto was not understood as if it was just metaphorical or figurative.
No, not metaphorical or figurative. No. Again, it might be that my terms are not useful, so I'll be happy to take them back. All I'm saying is, when you open up the edition of the Arizal as we know it,
Vital's
edition, and
it's Pshuto.
So not only is it kivshutoi, but what makes me almost laugh every time I look at the page, and you'll please tell me, when does the Euclidean diagram get integrated into the text? Surely not by the time of Chaim Vital, probably later, a later edition, no?
Yeah, I don't know. I have to check that.
Okay, so what I find...
I know what you're referring to, but I don't know.
So what I find, now the edition, the geometry, there's in the edition that we have of the Eitz Chaim, it shows a circle, it shows a dot, you flip the page and it shows a kav, a line, right? It looks like a page of Euclid, almost, right? And it's there, of course, because the language of the text is highly, highly geometrical. There's a circle, there's a dot, there's a line. Not only that, the text goes out of its way to say, by the way, not only is this a circle, but you should not let it enter into your mind that it might be a square or a triangle. It actually says it's not a square or a triangle. It's very geometric. This whole narrative, as you're reading the narrative, gives the impression of metaphysics. In other words, these are things here. There's light is a thing, God is a thing, this thing has to retract, there's empty space left over. Now Lokiv Shutoi comes along and says, guys, this is way too chunky here. This is too metaphysical. The story is a story that is epistemological. It's not about things. It's about understanding, it's about concealment. Light is not photons, light is the light of understanding, the light of the mind, the light of revelation. And so the whole story must be understood, as it were, in an epistemological trope rather than a metaphysical one. I think that's the. Do you agree with that kind of reading?
Now I understand what you're getting at. Yeah. Okay.
So now here.
I'll grant you that.
Yeah.
point.
Okay. Oh, it's a. I'll kiss you in front of the camera.
but
it's a big.
I just want to understand your topic of your concept of epistemology, because in Heidegger it all begins with the ontological difference, and that there is this difference between the being and beings, and that Heidegger recognized that in a way, because metaphysics is always interested in presence. It's always interested in objectifying something, or in objects, or it objectifies if it thinks, for instance, something like God. Yeah? God becomes an object. And that he recognized that metaphysics actually is not reflecting this problem. And at the end of this idea, this thought, Heidegger came to the point that he is, in a way, speaking of nothing when he speaks of being. Yeah. So that there is no object anymore to think about, that there is no object of speaking about. And this is, one can say, it's a non-objectifying saying and thinking. And I would ask you, is this also a problem in Kabbalah? Is this a problem the Kabbalists are thinking about?
No question about it, and that's why I feel that there is this great affinity between what the Kabbalists mark as Ein Sof and what Heidegger ultimately understood he was trying to articulate with regard to Sein. Mm-hmm. There is no thing there.
Okay.
So it's a point where being and non-being are indistinguishably the same.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So no, very, very. Yeah, I think they're on this point.
Okay, but then I would say then there is really a difference between a God of the Torah who speaks to the human being and the Ein Sof.
No question. I mentioned there's that text in the beginning of the 14th century, an anonymous Kabbalist, Spanish Kabbalist, who says there is no letter in all of the Torah that refers to the Ein Sof. Mm-hmm. Ein Sof is entirely outside the textual parameters. So he doesn't have the language, but if we translate it into Heideggerian terms, this is challenging the ontotheological or metaphysical understanding of God. Mm. It's not denying the God of revelation, but it's finding something which exceeds those parameters.
I hope I'm not sure I followed everything here. I'm not sure. Maybe say it one more time. That the Ein Sof, you're saying, is similar to being.
No,
to the being as nothingness.
To Heidegger's Sein, in the way that Peter just described it. He comes to, it's not a thing.
It's not a thing, of course.
It's outside of metaphysical or the ontotheological.
Yes. Look, I'm convinced, by the way, I had the merit, I guess, to communicate a little bit with von Hermann, who I know has interesting, a couple months before he passed away.
Okay.
And he published one of his earlier books, which is on the Wesen von Wahrheit, on the essay from 1930. And he makes a claim in that essay, he wrote a whole book on that essay, and he makes the claim that that's the Kehra, that's the turning point.
That's the turn?
According to von Hermann. Gadamer finds it in the Kunstwerk. Personally, I think they're both right. I do. I think it's the same motion. But I just want to focus on von Hermann's thesis because I think that's what's at play here. What? Huh? No? You have an issue with it?
I have to say that. Yeah, I think that's nonsense. But
which one?
The turning is not something what happens in the text.
Well, okay. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Okay, but that aside.
Play out.
From Wesen der Wahrheit, in the essence of truth, that's the text which is so powerful for me. Because there we see this, what we're talking about happening, namely that the entire narrative of being is shifted in a very powerful way to the narrative of Wahrheit, of Aletheia. And from that point on, actually, that's where the discourses start to hemorrhage into each other. In other words, the discourse of being, which still has resonances, echoes of metaphysical language, because being sounds like it is, right? And Heidegger, of course, wants to move beyond what is into what you're saying is the nothing, of course. But the really radical move, it seems to me, in that process of moving, of saying that the essence of being really is nothing, the radical turning that allows for that to happen is the shift of the discourse to truth. Because by shifting it to truth, in other words, by saying, look, the question of being is one of Verborgenheit, that there's a concealment that takes place. And that concealment allows then for beings to happen. So suddenly, das Seiende is no longer a being in the, metaphysical sense of a hard thing. Das Seiende becomes an emanation of truth itself. It's a truth event.
Emanation,
emanation might be the wrong word. But
I'm troubled by
it's not a Heideggerian word, yeah. He calls it a Sendung, it's a sending. He calls it a Gabe,
yes,
it's a gift.
So it's better to use.
Yeah, okay, we'll use Heideggerian language. It's something that Lethe sends out as Aletheia in the Lichtung. And the Lichtung is of course very important, because the Lichtung is an ambivalent term. On the one hand, it means Licht, light. On the other hand, it's a clearing in the forest, which is not light. They go together, of course.
Well, they go together.
Yeah, they go together. No, but I think it's important because in that essay he doesn't use, I don't remember if he uses Lichtung, but he definitely says das Offene, the open.
Yeah, Offenheit, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So Lethe retreats and allows and creates the open, like a kind of halal, and within that openness, then das Seiende appears as something which is apparent, right?
Appear in their disappearance.
Right, and he is actually, at that text he's not so careful, but by the Beiträge, the language becomes quite careful. He says, there he makes a subtle distinction between Anwesenheit and Seiendheit. So in other words, the very first manifestation of das Seiende is in Anwesenheit, in presencing, which is also the language of the Anaximander fragment. But later he said, but das Seiende is the beständige Anwesende. When the presence becomes solidified, when it gets feet, that's when it becomes das Seiende. So there's a process of hardening, as it were, of das Wesende. In any case, my point here, why am I bringing all this? Because this is, again, the shift, I believe, to the word epistemological is surely wrong. But I'm using old metaphysical categories to understand, to try to make sense of this shift. In Heidegger's language, it's a shift to aletheia. It's a shift from a discourse which focuses on things and being as a thing to a discourse which focuses on truth, where being is surely no longer a thing. It's a nothing.
And what you are describing is a problem, I guess, in Heidegger. And this problem is linked also with the topic of Techne. And that's also a problem. Maybe we have to speak about in the Kabbalistic context, because of course, the beings are appearing in the clearing. But now the question is how the human being Dasein, is experiencing this appearance. So I just want to say there are manuscripts where Heidegger not only writes Sein with a Y, with a Y being, but also Seiendes with a Y. Mm-hmm. And that is a hint to the problem. I don't think that Heidegger solved the problem, but he thinks it could be possible that there is a world, and now comes this term again, that there is a world where the relation between Dasein and the beings, like whatever, nature, trees, cups, jugs, where this relation is not dominated by total mobilization by technology in this sense we know. So that there is another world where the human being, the Dasein, learns to I don't know the English word schonen. He uses the word schonen often. What is schonen?
Schonen. It's not related to schön.
No, schonen means to be careful with things, to be attentive to things, not to use them only, not to spoil them, but to care for them and so on. And that is the problem that's the problem of the world and the techne in the world. How can the Dasein respond to, one could ask that, how can Dasein respond to the clearing? And of course, this has something to do with concealment. Because if Dasein is not able to understand the relation between revealment and concealment, Dasein only takes the objects as material objects there in the presence. Given, not even given, just in the presence there to use them.
Yeah.
But if you understand that there is something like the clearing, yeah, who is hiding itself, that the concealment is concealing itself. If you understand that, you stand at the beginning to understand what Heidegger calls the event.
Yeah.
And this is then in itself a different understanding of world and being in the world, just to want to say it like that. But this is related to techne and poiesis, because we have to understand what actually then poiesis or techne can be, not only whatever a technological tool to dominate something or to make it, but also to receive, to care for it and so on. Yeah.
Poiesis is the essence of techne, doesn't he say that also?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't he say that?
I think the essence of technology.
At least he makes a difference between poiesis and
No, but it's the essence.
But he's saying
it's the essence, no?
Yeah, I didn't mean by that he's saying there somehow that's the inner essence. So the way to get beyond, I guess he's recognizing you can't totally.
Yeah. Well, it's a problematic topic in a way, because, for instance, for poiesis for Aristotle is not so far away from techne. Techne is a dianoetic virtue in Aristotle. But for Aristotle, techne and poiesis are not so far away from. But Heidegger is, of course, he is interested in a different poiesis as a metaphysical concept of poiesis, and that's true. In this sense, poiesis in Heidegger is crucial for a certain understanding of being in the world.
Yeah.
I want to try to bring this back to the initial question, if I may. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think using what you've just said. I think what Heidegger says, to focus on Heidegger now, I think that this concept is incredibly beautiful, and it's actually not just incredibly beautiful; it is beauty itself. In other words, it's almost a kind of very radical aesthetics, I would say, almost. Heidegger is saying, look. You people, you human beings have made the world a crappy, ugly place. It's an ugly place to live. Technology is disgusting. The Industrial Revolution has made the world a really ugly place. It's ugly. There's so much smoke everywhere. There's so much noise everywhere. Everybody's traveling at the speed of light. Communication is happening way too quickly. Nobody has time. There's
not yet speed of light. Not yet.
Well, no, but he says distances are collapsed. There's no such thing as distance anymore. I can call up somebody in America like that. I am up on the moon, right? He says everything is destroyed. Everything is ugly. And not obviously in a cheap aesthetic sense of ugly, but in a very, very profound sense, the world is ugly. And I agree with him. I completely agree. The world, technology has made things ugly. And I think agree with him that being attuned to a poiesis in a more primordial way would probably put us in the direction of re-beautifying the world, beginning with, of course, Gelassenheit and so on, but to re-beautifying, re-poetizing the world. And so, dichterig wohnet der Mensch is for sure a desirable thing. That's a desideratum. Why shouldn't we live poetically upon this earth? And by the way, I would go so far to say that that's actually a very Jewish desire as well. And maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but it seems to me that's part and parcel of the messianic desire to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem.
Yeah, but you started this by trying to contrast.
Exactly. So having said that, again, remember, I want to make it clear, I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too.
By the way,
I want both.
I would give a gesture to penicillin and vaccines.
Why?
Technology.
Oh, technology. So
not making the world entirely. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's what he means. I think that's what he means by Gelassenheit.
I understand.
Right. I think that's Gelassenheit is exactly that.
I mean, I'm being
joking,
joking, but I'm also being serious here. That we have to be careful about this.
Yeah, sure. This was
dichotomy between.
This was Spinoza's. Spinoza was a celebrated technology for this reason, right? Spinoza says technology is wonderful. I mean, medicine. I mean, it's great stuff.
No, I'm
I'm
not saying it's wonderful. I'm just saying it's more complicated.
I'm with you, but
I just want to say that for Heidegger, of course, he wouldn't be a philosopher if he would explain that there has to be a world without technology. That's of course nonsense.
Right, exactly.
So one only has to think about the character of technology we are living in, and of course. You know that, for instance, in Germany, probably in the whole world, one of the main books today is The Principle of Responsibility by Hans Jonas, as a student of Martin Heidegger, and that's the question how we can solve this problem of the so-called climate catastrophe.
Right.
And this has something to do with technology and our understanding of technology.
Right.
Well, in the very general way, of course.
So I mean, basically,
not to mention artificial intelligence.
That's a whole other thing. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
In other words, Heidegger would like to see us regain a mastery over technology rather than to be its slave.
Okay.
If you could put it that way, it's crudely put. I know.
So how
now here's my Jewish question, though, because everything I've just said has very little to do with Torah and Judaism, right? Where I don't think the Torah is essentially antithetical to that. I don't think so, but I think the Torah is offering something in addition to that, which I believe is more essential, and which probably in the end will even facilitate that. It doesn't stand in contradiction to that in the sense of the Torah hates poiesis, Jews hate poetry, we want to live in an ugly world, let's go live in Mea Sharim and make sure everything is disgusting and there's technology everywhere, as opposed to the beautiful, when I was a young man, I lived in Freiburg for a couple of months, and I used to go into the Schwarzwald just for walks in the Schwarzwald. And it's so beautiful. And the whole Freiburg is beautiful. Budapest is beautiful. Europe is beautiful. You go to Geula or Mea Sharim, and it's such a disappointment. And you could say, well, Jews, we're not aesthetic people. We don't care about aesthetics. I think that's unfortunate. I think we have a lot to learn from European sense of style and beauty, which ultimately is rooted in a European sensibility to poiesis. Europe, since Homer, has been pursuing the beautiful on the deepest possible level. And it seems to me that Heidegger is saying, let's get back to that. Let's do poiesis the way it should be done. Let's not allow these other forces to overrun it. And that might be part of his anti-Semitism, by the way, because Machenschaft, in the whole discourse of Machenschaft in a way is inimical to this, right? What I'm saying is that granted that poiesis is essential and even has a place and an important place in Judaism, I'm saying that what Torah has to offer and what Torah insists on offering is that this whole discourse must be understood as communication. Again, to come back to communication.
Right. So, and my challenge to you was even the dialogical or the communicative seems to be
that brings us back to
entrap one in some form of poetic configuration if you want to maintain the theistic resonance of what you're describing.
Yeah, I have to. Please, you have to give me just a few minutes to respond to that because I think it's a very important challenge. It's a very important challenge.
You're the timekeeper.
Okay. No, I'm not.
Take
Well,
us-
I guess I am. Yeah, that's not. It's true. It's not fair. I'm sorry. I am. I'm the the headmaster of the school, so I have an unfair advantage. I'm sorry.
It's not unfair. It's okay.
Yeah, I am. Yeah,
There's
I
not-
hope
there-
I'm not I'm a host, but I hope I'm not inhospitable.
There has to be a timekeeper.
What?
There has to be.
Yeah, that has to be right.
Let me respond to that like this. It seems to
You
me
can never trust the timekeeper to keep time.
it's true. It's true. So you guys keep me in check.
Yeah.
You know. It seems to me, Elliot, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, stop me at any point if I'm going in the wrong direction, okay? It seems to me that what you're saying runs parallel, not identical, but runs in a strong parallel to the most important and the most powerful critique of Levinas, which was offered by Derrida. Derrida, in his essay on violence and metaphysics, basically makes this type of argument, right?
Yeah.
Derrida says, you talk about the other, you talk about alterity, you talk about encounter between you and the radically other, and in this discourse of affirming the otherness of the other, of course, you need to criticize metaphysical language, because metaphysical language is an obstruction to otherness, right? You're not really, you're employing metaphysics in this sense, and therefore you are undermining your own project. You're using metaphysical language, which is the language of sameness, which collapses all otherness into sameness, to try to articulate otherness. It's a contradictio in adjecto, what you're doing. And I think, in a sense, that's what I think, right? Is that, yeah? Bernasconi has a great article on this as well, by the way, on Derrida's reading of Levinas. I personally think that Derrida on this point is 100% right. And I actually completely agree with you on this point. But I agree with you. I am a passionate Levinasian, but I must say that on this point, I am not. I think this is the weakness in Levinas. I think Levinas capitulated to phenomenology in the end. However, at the same time, he doesn't do that in the Talmudic lectures, by the way, but definitely in Totality and Infinity and Autrement qu'être, he is, by definition, capitulating to the discourse of his master Husserl. He is coming to articulate a Jewish thought using phenomenological language, which is impossible at the end of the day. Now I would say this, though, because at the end of the day, I personally am a committed Levinasian. I would say that I'm committed to being generous in reading Levinas, and I would say that Levinas has fallen prey, is a victim to what almost any Jewish thinker, any Jewish philosopher is going to naturally fall prey to, which is that the Jewish thinker has this difficulty of trying to articulate a full-bodied encounter with the divine, number one, and number two, with other human beings. And yet the language of philosophy from the beginning until today will always frustrate that attempt, necessarily, and there's no way around that frustration. So the only thing that I can do as a Jewish philosopher or as a reader of Jewish philosophers, hermeneutically, is to say, look, Derrida uses this language, which I find so beautiful. I'm not using it in Derrida's way, I'm using it in my own way. But Derrida uses the French term vouloir dire. Vouloir dire, in his first book on Husserl, in his second book on Husserl, he translates Bedeutung, right, because there's Bedeutung and Sinn. So he translates into French, Bedeutung is vouloir dire. Now, vouloir dire literally means I want to say, je veux dire. But when a Frenchman says je veux dire, it's probably better, if you're an Englishman, to translate that as I mean. Not that I want to say. That's what je veux dire means. I mean, right? That's the real meaning of it. I mean. Now, when I approach Levinas's text, I say there is a je veux dire here. In other words, Levinas says what he says in metaphysical language and fails. But beneath that, there is a veut dire. He wants to say something else which is very Jewish, which never comes to language, which is the dialogical element.
Well, at one point he speaks, I think it's in Totality and Infinity, of the personal, invisible God. Now, therein, as they say, lies the dead dog. I mean, it's fine, invisible, and there's a whole long history of divine invisibility. But how are you going to construe a personal, invisible God? Now, I know the argument, the Levinasian argument, because that's precisely what personhood is for him.
Exactly.
I understand, but to my mind, it still opens him up to criticism.
Necessarily. There's no way around it. Really, I totally agree with you. There's no way around it. There's
not in terms of divinity, but even intersubjectively, I think it's problematic what he's articulating here.
I 100% agree with you.
Even though I understand that the grander or the nobler aim here is to protect subjectivity from objectivity,
yes.
from objectifying the other.
Yes.
And so therefore the personhood or the face is precisely that which can never be visualized. It falls outside the phenomenology of spectrality. I got the whole thing, but I still come down to a sense of philosophical discomfort.
I do. I agree. The only, I think, all I'm suggesting is that there's the possibility of a hermeneutic, and there's no way around what you're saying. It's impossible to get around it. All I'm suggesting is that there's an attitude, there's a hermeneutic decision.
You think he was aware of it?
I do. I really do.
Really?
I do. I love the man. I love him. No, I mean, to me, when I read a book, that's my first question: do I love the man or not?
Maybe you should. Yeah. You should, because I have to moderate. He said to me, maybe you should both. Yeah. Also for everybody here, be a little bit clearer in what you are criticizing in Levinas, because what actually Elliot says is beyond Husserlian phenomenology. That's exactly the point that the face and what is seen through the face, that's not a Husserlian idea anymore.
He's beyond Husserl.
Yeah, he's beyond. Yeah. So in this sense, you should be a little bit clearer. What is actually the critical point here?
Well,
because you both said this is critical. I want to suggest because that you understand what is critical in this idea that Levinas is what Heidegger, of course, definitely not does, and what Derrida was actually misunderstanding. The later Derrida is much more just to Levinas. You know, they came closer.
That's true.
So what do you are you criticizing that Derrida, that Levinas is referring to a personified God, to a personified divinity?
That he wants to posit an alterity, a transcendence, an infinity, or what he eventually will call the otherwise than being, which can't be reduced to the same, can't be rendered into a thing or an object. And at the same time, he still is subject to personifying that transcendence. Right.
Okay. And you think that's problematic?
Yeah, that's problematic. And the way it came up here is because Michael was trying to suggest that there's a surplus in Judaism, which is beyond the poetic.
Maybe not just in Judaism, by the way. I would say in poetry in general.
Okay, but that's. Yeah, I'm trying to keep it on. You know how this conversation has been unfolding, and that you called it the communicative, or you agreed to the term dialogical as opposed to the monological. And what I was just saying, that even if we take Levinas, we could also discuss this in terms of Buber, by the way, but let's just stay on Levinas. Or since I mentioned Buber, Buber has a statement in I and Thou where he says, right, it's the melancholy fate that every I and Thou has to become
beautiful. Yes,
expressed within the I it. Right? So Buber himself is aware of, and by the way, the term theomania comes from Buber's I and Thou. He uses the term theomania, right? And by which he means exactly this tendency to personify the Thou.
Yes.
And so that's what I'm talking about. Is that clear a little bit? That's what I find problematic, philosophically speaking, in Levinas.
So again, all I'm suggesting, in addition, not in contradiction to that, but if you will, as a supplement, and by the way, and not just as a supplement, but also as a hermeneutic decision that everyone has to make, and everyone makes his own. I've made mine. You will make yours. There's no way around the decision. There's nothing that will compel that decision. Nothing. I really don't think it's a pure decision that the reader brings to the text. Okay. I would say
decision about what?
Let me give a crude metaphor for this. I would say like this: if I were challenged to write a poem or a description about my love for my wife or my children, I have no doubt, and I'm not a bad writer. I'm not the best writer by far, but I could write a really good poem, a really good story. I could write it down. I could explain. I could give a lecture about it. I have no doubt that at the end of the day, a person listening to that poem would say, well, that's not really love. That is, if I may put it in a Freudian trope, that's really your projection of your desires, of what you need, of your neuroses upon the other. And it's really ultimately a solipsistic, or as we used to say, I don't know if they use this term anymore, psychologically deterministic. In other words, you're trying to articulate a non-egoism, but you're really an egoist in which this egoism somehow includes the other. Now, I have no doubt that there's no way for me as a poet to escape that trap. That trap is absolutely inescapable because language itself, thought itself, expression itself, will inevitably take what is an encounter and reduce it to something essentially monological. There's no way around it. All I'm saying is that the reader has to make a hermeneutic decision when coming to this text and has to say, look, is there actual love here in the strongest sense of the word? Is there an encounter here with another? Yes or no? Because the text will not allow, the text will definitely not make it possible for me to make that move. It's my decision as a reader. That's it.
That's exactly the question of authority. That is really what we're talking about here.